Hello again, everybody, and we are going to skip over chapter 11 for the time being, and next week or so, we will get back into chapter 11. Chapter 11, again, as I mentioned in the last lecture, is an extension of chapter 10, which talks about the different threats to internal validity, being as internal validity is the most important validity in a causal claim. Chapter 11 goes into more of the specific types of um, validity threats. So in chapter 10, we just talked about ones like confounds or unsystematic variants. We talked about order effects. We talked about selection effects. And then we're going to get into more specific ones in chapter 11. But because the nature of your final paper is going to be exactly what I asked for with seed articles, which is an experiment with more than one independent variable, something we call a factorial design, I always skip chapter 11 to go to chapter 12 so that you can sort of understand as you guys are working on papers or the concepts of these papers for more than one independent variable. What's going to happen this week is we are going to go over chapter 12, and I will also give you an assignment and a lecture on the how to write a results section. I just have to figure out if my template is online available or if I have to type a new one up. So, that'll take some digging. I will also provide you either this week or early next week with a paper that the class will be using as a seed article for everybody. I have a few that I want to look over to make sure, and then I will talk about what we are going to do with that moving forward. Chapter 12 has about 45 slides in it, so I figure I might as well sort of break it up into two lectures. So I'll give you this one first, and depending on how much I get done tonight, I may be recording the second half. We are going to articulate, at least I am, in this chapter, how a crossed factorial design works. Remember that when we were looking at an experiment with only one IV and 2 levels, or even 3 levels, we only had one effect that we were looking at. Was one group higher or lower than another? In this case, we have 2 independent variables with 2 levels. So we're going to ask those same questions. Is one independent variable level higher or lower than the other independent variable level for the first IV? We're going to ask the same thing for the second IV. And then we're going to talk about what we call an interaction, which is asking, are there differences in the difference? You don't have to know what that means at this point. I will get to that. So I will explain 2 reasons to conduct a factorial study as opposed to just conducting 2 studies separately with 2 independent variables. We will review studies with 1 independent variable, which just show a simple difference, and then describe what I call the interaction as a difference in differences. So you'll see what I mean. Then we are going to describe interactions in terms of it depends. I did just realize that there is a chapter assignment for this that we will work on this week. So maybe the what's it called? The results section will be held off till next week. We'll see what we're dealing with at that point. So interactions, when we talk about them, is there an interaction or not? We like to use the term "it depends," and you'll see what that means as we get into it. We are also going to estimate marginal means and figure out how to do that to look at main effects. And we are going to identify interaction effects in 2 ways. We can use a table And we can actually point out an interaction, whether or not there is one, by looking at a graph. And the sort of secret behind that is non-parallel lines. You'll see what I mean. And it should be pretty easy to figure out. For number 7, we are going to, oh, sorry, I just did that one, sorry. It's been a long day. Given a factorial notation, which is 2 by 2, you're going to know what that number means. In this case, it's the number of independent variables is the first number, and the number of levels in each variable is the second number. Sorry. Moving on. It's the number of levels in the first variable and the number of levels in the second variable. You'll see what I mean. So we'll go over that, the number of cells in the design, and the number of main effects and interactions that will be relevant. You did get an idea that we have 3, so I'm going to stick with that. We're also going to look at 3-way factorial designs, but not until the second half of this lecture. And you will be able to determine from a graph whether a study shows a 3-way interaction. Now, in a 2 by 2, we would have a 2-way interaction. So we're going to make it a little more complicated. You're never going to have to do this for your paper, but it is good to know and be able to understand the concept. And then finally, we will interpret keywords that indicate there's a factorial design in a journal article, and interpret keywords in popular press articles that may indicate more than one independent variable or a factorial design. So before I get too mixed up with things, let's move on to the lecture. So we are going to review what we talked about in chapter 10, which are the simple experiments with one independent variable. Then we will go on and talk about how we add a second independent variable with at least 2 levels, and how experiments with 2 independent variables not only give us effects, or what we would call main effects, but they can show interactions between the variables. Then we will talk about factorial variations and identifying factorial designs and readings. Of course, that will be in the second lecture. So, experiments with one independent variable. As we talked about last week, the best way to look at an experiment with one independent variable is using a bar graph. It's not using a scatter plot, it's not using a line graph. And I will show you why. So here, let's look at the example, and also this gives us practice on how to read a graph. So here we see in A, on the top left, we have along the x-axis, remember that's your manipulated or independent variable and its levels. So here we have a placebo group and a drunk group. The drunk group has a blood alcohol content or level of 0.10. For those of you not familiar, the legal limit is 0.08. So this would be, on average, people in this group are legally drunk. That is your alcohol intake. You can see the graph is nicely labeled. On the left is your y-axis. That's your measured variable, your dependent variable, whatever it is that we're measuring. In this case, in A, it's the intensity of shock on a 1 to 10 scale. And then down in B, we have the same alcohol intake, placebo and drunk group, and we see the duration of the shock in number of seconds. So, looking at the first one, this basically was a study that was done to look and see, it was a fake experiment, meaning the person thought that they were shocking another person, and they wanted to see if the amount of alcohol in your system, or if you were drunk versus not drunk legally, would make a difference on both how intense the shock was on a scale of 1 to 10 towards somebody, and how long you held the button for, the duration of the shock. So in A, they had people who drank something that did not have alcohol in it, and people that had a blood alcohol content above 0.08, considered drunk. And if we look at the intensity of shock, it looks like on a scale of 1 to 10, if you were going to shock another person, it was just under 5, about 4.5 maybe, for the placebo group. And for the group that had been drinking, the intensity was up to 6. So you can see there was a pretty significant, it looks significant difference between 4.5 and 6 in terms of intensity. If I was to tell you I was going to give you a shock on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say that 4.5 to 6 is a pretty big jump. So the drunk group showed a significantly higher intensity of shock towards somebody when they were drunk. And in the duration of shock, which again helps to lend to this same idea, not only was the shock more intense, but it lasted a lot longer. So for the placebo group, looking at how long that they shocked this person for was less than 1 second, maybe about 0.75 seconds, 3/4 of a second. The drunk group, however, was above or at about 2 seconds. So that was at least, I would say, about 3 times higher. So not only did the drunk group have a higher intensity of shock, but they also held on for 3 times longer when drunk. This would show us in an experiment, right, simple experiment, that the drunk group was more effective in, or showed a higher intensity and duration of shock towards people. Why don't we use a line graph for a simple experiment with 1 IV? Well, here you can see, looking at, we looked at this example kind of in chapter 3, breaking onset time in milliseconds and whether a person is on the cell phone or not on the cell phone. And here we can see that on their cell phone, it took significantly longer. It took about 1,000 milliseconds to break. When they were not on their cell phone and not distracted, it only took about 850 milliseconds. So you can kind of see, where one line ends and the other line ends, and that's sort of your measuring stick, but it's much easier visually to see it in a bar graph like the one on the left. When we get into experiments with 2 IVs, you're going to see why a line graph is actually a lot better than a bar graph to see these things, especially when we're going to talk about an interaction. So experiments with 2 independent variables can show the effects of one level of an IV over another. So in this case, if I go back, we're looking at drunk versus placebo on intensity in A, drunk versus placebo on duration in B, and you can see that one level, the drunk group, is higher than the placebo group in both. You can see the cell phone is higher or takes a longer time to break than not on a cell phone, even in a line graph. But when we add more variables, it allows us to see the independent effects of one variable and its levels at a time, but we can also see both together, and that's what we call an interaction. Does one variable have an effect or interact with the other variable? So, we are going to talk today about experiments with 2 independent variables and how it can show the independent effects of each variable, but it can also show the impact of them put together. And that's basically the reason that you'd want to do something like this. So we're going to talk about what we call intuitive interactions, being able to identify them from either the graph or the numbers in a table. Looking at how factorial designs study 2 independent variables and why we would do that. In this section, we'll talk about how factorial designs can test limits and sometimes can actually be used to test theories. And then finally, how do we interpret factorial results, main effects and interactions, which we may save to the next one. So, looking at interactions, the way that we're going to make this as simplistic as possible is that we are going to say that for this chapter at least, the idea of an interaction, when you read it on a graph, is any lines that are not parallel. So the easiest, of course, would be a crossover interaction where the lines cross over and make an X. Maybe one line is increasing and the other line is decreasing. This is the way that we see there is an interaction. So, looking at this crossover interaction on the left, let's read what the information says. First of all, let me point out that when we have a factorial design, you have more than one IV, right? That's by nature what a factorial design means. That's what you were looking for in your seed article critiques. So, you still have the one dependent variable on the y-axis, but now you have a dilemma because you have 2 independent variables. So one of the independent variables is going to go where the x-axis is, and it's going to be the two levels of one independent variable. So where does the other one go? Well, as you can see in this graph on the left, the other independent variable levels are the lines. So in this case, we have two independent variables. We have type of food. So on one side, you see ice cream on the left, and on the right is pancakes. That's the type of food. That's one independent variable. Ice cream and pancakes are the two levels of that variable. The other variable is the temperature of the food. So in green, you have cold, and in yellow, you have hot. The dependent variable is a scale of how much you like it. So we could say that's a scale of maybe 1 to 7 or 1 to 4 or something like that. So your dependent variable is how much you like the food. Now, we're looking at how these variables interact with one another. So you can see that yellow, there's a yellow for ice cream, there's a yellow for pancakes, which is hot. There's a green for ice cream and a green for pancakes, which is cold. Ice cream, as you would imagine, is best enjoyed when it's cold. So you can see in green, when ice cream is cold at the top, people really like it. When ice cream is hot, not so much liking it, right? Otherwise, they're just drinking like melted creamy stuff, which could get sticky and get everywhere. Pancakes are usually a dish best served hot. So as you can see on the left, on the right, when it's hot, pancakes are liked a lot more. When they are cold, the pancakes are not liked very much. So there is an interaction. The lines are not parallel. If ice cream and pancakes lines, if the yellow and the green lines were parallel to each other, there would be no interaction. But because they are not parallel, in this case, they're crossing over. Ice cream's best liked cold, pancakes are best liked hot. Neither are liked in the opposite fashion. That is getting trained. We have two independent variables. Again, one of them will be on the x-axis, and the other one will be the lines. Now, the question you might have is, does it matter which one is which? The nice thing about this spreading interaction is that actually it doesn't matter which one is the lines or which one is on the x-axis, because they will give you the same information no matter which one you put there. If there's an interaction, there's going to be an interaction no matter which one is the lines and which one is on the x-axis. So let's look and see on top for the spreading interaction what this says and what it means. So here we have two independent variables. The dependent variable is going to be the proportion of time a dog actually sits. So this is looking at different methods to see how effective it is to maybe train a dog or a puppy. So here we have what is said, right? The first variable on the x-axis. You either say nothing or you say the word sit. And then the other independent variable is whether or not the dog is, or the trainer is holding a treat. So we see say nothing or say sit. So what you say to the dog, commands to the dog, and level of treat, whether you have a treat that you're holding or whether there's no treat at all. So what you see here is for the yellow line, when there's no treat, whether you say nothing or you say sit, nothing happens. The dog does not sit. If you are holding a treat but say nothing, the dog is still not sitting. In this case, the only time that one of the lines moves for 1 second or so is if you're holding a treat and you say sit. This is a spreading interaction. So one of these, when you're holding a treat, it increases. The other line, when you have no treat, does nothing. It stays flat. There's no difference. So one is increasing, the other line is staying the same. Again, they're not parallel, so that is a spreading interaction. So what would happen if you were to switch the axes? So now holding a treat and no treat is on the bottom, and saying nothing is in green, saying sit is in yellow. If you're not holding a treat, even if you say sit, you see that there's nothing happening. If you're holding a treat and you say nothing in green, or no treat and say nothing, you see that there is a straight line there. Now, holding a treat and saying sit on the top, it becomes the top left, and that is a proportion of time where the dog actually sits for about a second. And then it goes back down to nothing if you're not holding a treat. So it's the same exact information, and they both show a spreading interaction. And so what this just shows you is that it doesn't matter which is on the x-axis and which is the lines, because no matter what, if there's an interaction, you're going to see it no matter which variable is on the x-axis and which variable is the lines. Now, when we look at factorial designs, again, we are studying two independent variables. And remember what we talked about from chapter 10, the variables have to have at least two levels, usually a control and experimental group, sometimes a little bit different depending on what it is. But we're going to talk about a 2 by 2. In this case, when I say a 2 by 2, just the number of variables that we have, blank by blank, that tells you how many IVs there are in the experiment. So if it's a 2 by 2 design, what that means is there are two independent variables, and the numbers represent the number of levels in each one. So if one variable is whether or not you are on a cell phone, that's the first two. On a cell phone versus not on a cell phone. So one would be cell phone type. On a cell phone, not on a cell phone. That's two levels of one independent variable. That's the first two. And then we say it's a 2 by 2. So the other variable in this case is the age of the driver. So we have younger drivers and we have older drivers. In this case, that makes this study a 2 by 2. Saying 2 by 2 means two independent variables. The first two is the number of levels on cell phone versus not on cell phone. The second two is, again, the second independent variable with two levels, younger drivers and older drivers. 2 by 2 design. So looking at this and the number of cells, what we say is that there are 4 cells. You have 2 IVs with 2 levels each. So that gives you 2 by 2. If you multiply, that gives you 4 cells. So we have on cell phone and not on cell phone. We have younger drivers and we have older drivers. That gives us 4 groups. Younger drivers on cell phones, younger drivers not on cell phones, older drivers on cell phones, and older drivers not on cell phones. I hope you're still with me on this. So we can use factorial designs to study manipulated variables, or we can study what we call participant variables. So what is a participant variable? A participant variable is something that we can't randomly assign into a group. So to give you examples of this, a participant variable could be gender, male versus female. Yes, I do realize that there are special circumstances with transgender individuals or things like that. But if we think about it the traditional way, and I'm not saying not to think about it in a progressive way, but people that were male have the genitalia or whatever you want, however you want to operationally define, and so they can't really be changed to go into the women group. The women cannot be changed to go into the male group. So let me use a better one. We can go eye color, right? Eye color is you're either brown-eyed, blue-eyed, green-eyed, whatever it is, right? That usually doesn't change. Yes, you could use, contact lenses or something like that, but generally that doesn't change. Height, taller or shorter, you can't control that. Here is another one, age, younger versus older. We can manipulate where the cutoff is, right? Because majority of people in our class are probably between, 19 and 23. We can separate it into like 19 to 25 and then 26 and older, or something like that. But participant variables are ones that you can't randomly assign into groups. But in a factorial design, participant variables are treated just like an independent variable, just like as if we could manipulate it, right? Because the one thing we can manipulate maybe is what we define as older or younger. We can do a different age cutoff or things like that. So those are what we call participant variables. Either way, this gives you 4 groups: younger drivers on their cell phone, younger drivers not on their cell phone, older drivers on their cell phone, older drivers not on their cell phone. Looking at this, we have 4 cells. So we use these sort of tables like the one on the left to be able to graph the results on the right. Now, I'm going to go back to the example we just used a couple slides ago using breaking onset time. We talked about drivers on their cell phone versus drivers not on their cell phone. Now, we have 4 groups. As you can see on the left, we have younger drivers on their cell phone, which gives you a break time. The DV is going to be the number that's written in these boxes. So for younger drivers on their cell phone, we see a breaking onset time of 912 milliseconds. For younger drivers that are not on their cell phone, we see a breaking time of 780 milliseconds, so it's lower. For older drivers on their cell phone, we see that's the highest group of all, 1086 milliseconds, and for older drivers not on their cell phone, they seem to have about the same amount of time as younger drivers on their cell phone, 912 milliseconds. So we can see and we can graph all of those. So the blue line, dark blue line, they're both blue lines, sorry about that. The dark blue line is younger drivers. So here you see younger drivers on the cell phone is at about 912 milliseconds. Down below, younger drivers not on their cell phone is down at 780. For older drivers, it's higher. We have 1086 and we have 912. So it ends on the same place that the blue line begins. Now, looking at these lines on the graph, we can see that the lines are pretty parallel. They are going the same direction. They are dipping about the same amount. So in this case, it does not seem to be a difference. Younger drivers and older drivers, right? Older drivers on average for both, whether they're on their cell phone or not, are higher or take longer to break than younger drivers. But the difference between on their cell phone and not on their cell phone seems to be about the same. And the way that we can look at this as well is by just subtracting simply, right? If you go 912 minus 780, and then you go 1086 minus 912, you'll get roughly the same number, which shows in a couple different ways, and I'll get to this way a little more with practice, that you can see that the lines are pretty parallel, which means we do not have an interaction between cell phone type and age of the driver. Hopefully that's understandable. So, as we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, we can test limits on things, factorial designs. It's almost a form of external validity, because remember when we talk about external validity, we talk about repeating a procedure, or can we generalize it to different groups and to different situations and perhaps different times. So in this case, we can look at things, add a group, and see if the effect is the same for other people, right? When I went with the original example for you guys in class for the first few weeks when we were there, I talked about the studying versus not studying. So one of the things that we could have done to make it a factorial design, we had studying versus not studying. That's one independent variable. A way that we can test it is to look at the type of studying. So we could have 0 hours of studying, 6 hours of studying, and then we could talk about, different types of studying if we wanted to. And of course, in chapter 8, we also talked about, is there another variable that's moderating a relationship? Well, in an experiment, we talked about moderators. We don't want a third variable. But if we add another independent variable, then we can see if these variables interact with each other, or if they are moderating a relationship. Hopefully that makes sense. So here, if you look on the right, we can see the effect of alcohol on aggression, and we have drunk group and placebo group, like the original study a few slides ago, in shock intensity. And then we've added a second variable. So on the x-axis, we have lighter men, on average of about 150 pounds, and heavier men, with an average of about 215 pounds in that group. And we want to see, we already know, based on the original study, that the drunk group had a higher shock intensity than the placebo group. But now we can see if this extends to see the same thing in men that are thinner or lighter and men that are heavier. So what we see, according to this graph on top, is that the lines are going in different directions. The green line is almost the same, but gets a little bit lower as you go from light to heavier men. So it decreases slightly, the shock intensity. And for the drunk group, it's all higher than the placebo group, but the heavier men, the shock intensity goes even higher than with light men. So here we do see an interaction, because the lines are definitely not parallel. One is increasing, one is slightly decreasing, right? And how would we explain this? Well, I like to use the as you go from one level to the next level. So what we can say is, as you go from light men to heavy men, those in the placebo group slightly decrease, and those in the drunk group increase, right? So either way, we see an interaction. And the bottom one, again, if you see an interaction on top, it doesn't matter which one is the x-axis and which one is the line. So here, we just switched. It's still shock intensity. It's still drunk and placebo group. It's still light and heavy men. But what we did was we swapped the IVs. So now on the x-axis, we have placebo group and drunk group. And for the lines, in yellow, we have light, and in green, we have heavier men. And sometimes how you sort of group the data, which one is on the x-axis, may help to tell a better picture. What does that mean? So again, we can explain it like we did in the top one, where those in the drunk group increased and those in the placebo group decreased as you went from light to heavier men. Here, it might be even easier to explain this graph. So what we can say is, as you go from a placebo group to a drunk group, both light and heavy men increase their shock intensity, but the heavier men do so even greater. Or as you go from placebo to drunk, both groups increase, but this is especially true for heavier men, right? So you can see the yellow line is increasing slightly, and the green line is increasing even more. So again, even though it doesn't look the same as the lines in the top one, you still see that they're not parallel, and therefore you can tell that both of these have an interaction. So we can also use factorial designs to test theories, right? We may want to know what other things we can test with the Stroop task. I gave you guys, when I went over the introduction section in class, many moons ago now it seems like, we talked about using factorial designs, we talked about looking at the effects of two levels of a variable, and would there be anything that would affect that? So one of the things we talked about at the end of the introduction discussion or lecture was what could we add to the Stroop task to make it interesting? What other factors could we add? And so we talked about things like lighter room versus darker room, distracting noise versus not distracting, jumbling the letters of the words versus not jumbling them, and seeing if that would have an additive or if it would sort of correct the deficit. And so this is sort of the idea with a factorial design. We can test theories using more cues or using interactions to test memory theories. So looking at alcohol cues, we talk about how alcohol seems to make people more aggressive, at least according to that first study that we just looked at with alcohol intake and intensity shock and duration. So here we wanted to see, not we, but the authors of this experiment wanted to see if alcohol or non-alcohol cues and aggression-related words would cause more of a reaction or a faster reaction. So here we see another 2-by-2 experiment. We have type of photo, alcohol and plant, 2 levels. So that's the first 2. And we have type of word or word type, aggression-related and neutral, 2 by 2, both independent variables with 2 levels. We have one dependent or measured variable. Below, you can see it says reaction time measured in milliseconds. So this, again, 2 by 2 design gives us 4 groups. We have aggressive words and a photo of alcohol. We have aggressive words and a photo of a plant. We have neutral words and a photo of alcohol. And we have neutral words and a photo of a plant. And the question is there a difference in reaction time depending on the type of photo and the type of word? So what we see here, and again, you can probably, you don't even need to know what the numbers are at first, but you can look down at the bottom. Alcohol photo, plant photo. The lines are dark blue, aggression-related words, light blue, neutral words. What we see is for an alcohol photo with aggression-related words, it took the shortest amount of time. Although plant photos with neutral words were almost as fast. Alcohol photo with neutral words took the longest amount of time, and a plant photo with aggression-related words kind of in the middle there. Now this is really, really sort of, the graph is really, really sort of zoomed in, just so you can see this effect. Because if you look at the numbers, 551, 559, 562, and 552, these are milliseconds. That is, the difference of 10 milliseconds is really not a lot. But if you zoom in on the graph, you can see it on the graph. Using an interaction to test a memory theory. Well, here we see something that memory researchers tested in the 1970s, which is something called context-dependent memory. And if you had me for Psych 1, you would know because I do the memory chapter. And a lot of times I use this study to sort of hammer the point home. So what do we see here? We see another 2 by 2. IV1 is recall condition with 2 levels, water's edge, underwater. IV2, learning condition, 2 levels, water's edge, underwater. Again, that makes this a 2 by 2. The first IV has 2 levels. The second IV has 2 levels, 2 by 2 design. The dependent variable in this one is the memory score, or number of words correct. So the idea behind context-dependent memory is the theory that we tend to recall things better where we learn them initially, where we form that memory. So that's why when we are on campus, we have an advantage when we take an exam in the same classroom where we learned the information, right? And so researchers wanted to test this to see if that was indeed correct, to make sure when we talk about memory and context-dependent memory that it's really a thing, right? So we can use this to test that theory. Here we have 4 groups. We have people who learned at the water's edge and people who learned words underwater. And then we have people split up into people who recalled at the water's edge and people who recalled underwater. So this gives us 4 groups. Learned at the water's edge, recalled at the water's edge, learned at the water's edge, recalled underwater, learned underwater, recalled at the water's edge, learned underwater, and recalled underwater. So these could be people that were, divers or, things like that. So everybody learned a list of words. They either learned the list of words at the edge of the water, but on land, or they learned it underwater while wearing scuba gear. And then they either recalled, half of them either recalled it at the water's edge, and the other half recalled underwater. So you have 2 of them, 2 groups that recalled where they learned, and you have the other 2 groups that recalled in a different place than they originally learned. So what we see, first and foremost, you should be able to tell from the graph on the right, it is an X. It's a crossover interaction. So it is an interaction. The lines are not parallel. So what do we see? Looking at the number of words correctly recalled. On the left, we have the table. So those who learned at the water's edge and also recalled at the water's edge, on average, got about 13 and a half right, correctly. Those who learned at the water's edge but recalled underwater only got about 8.5 right, 8.6. On the other side, those who learned underwater and recalled at the water's edge got about 8.4 correct, about the same as the other one. And those who learned underwater and recalled underwater got about 11.4, 11 and a half correct, much closer to the 13 and a half. So what you see is, according to this graph, those who learned at the water's edge recalled much more, significantly more at the water's edge, and those who learned underwater recalled significantly more underwater than recalling it at a different place than they learned it. So not only does this show us an interaction, but it actually shows us that that theory of context-dependent memory is correct, because we see a higher number for those who recalled where they learned it on both sides. So when we interpret factorial results, we are going to have, instead of one prediction or one hypothesis of one level is going to be higher than another level, we're going to have three different outcomes. So we are going to look at each individual IV separately, and then we're going to see if they interact with one another and look at them all at the same time. So a main effect says, is there an overall difference? And an interaction says, is there a difference in the differences? Although main effects can be important because we do want to know if one level of an IV is bigger or smaller, greater or less than the other level, the most important thing and the whole reason we run a factorial design is to see if these two variables interact with each other. So interactions are almost always, if not always, more important than main effects. So we're going to look at the possible main effects and interactions in a 2x2 factorial design. So looking at these, the main effect says, is there an overall difference? Again, we go back to that first example from a couple slides ago. Phototype, alcohol and plant. Word type, aggressive and neutral. Now, we need to find out, for a main effect, what we're saying is, it's a main effect of one of the variables and their two levels, as if the other variables or variable didn't exist. So in this case, IV1 is phototype and IV2 is word type. If we're looking for a main effect of phototype, it's almost like word type isn't even there. If we're looking at the main effect for word type, it's almost like phototype isn't even there, because again, we're only looking at one level over the other. So in order to do that, because we have four groups, we have to average the means of each group. So you can see that for IV1 phototype, we have alcohol, and there's two different numbers for that, 551 and 562, because one was for aggressive and one was for neutral. For plant, we have two different sets of numbers, one for aggressive, one for neutral. Plant aggressive and plant neutral, 559 and 552. So how do we pretend that the other IV doesn't exist? Well, we simply do what we would do in statistics. We are going to get the average of those two numbers. So for alcohol, if we want the average of alcohol between aggressive and neutral, we just add the numbers and divide by 2. We have 551 and 562. And down here you can see, for a main effect, we put them in the margins. So we call these the marginal means. 551 and 562. The average between them is 556 and a half. And you can go ahead and do the math if you want. Pause this and add 551 and 562, which will get you about 1113. And if you divide that by 2, you'll get 556 and a half. For plant, we see 559 and 552, which gives you about, 1111. And if you divide that in half, or divided by 2, 555 and a half. So when you are looking at the overall difference of one IV over the other, we have for alcohol overall, as if there was no other IV, for alcohol phototype, we have an average of 556 and a half. For plant, we have 555 and a half. Is there a difference between 1 millisecond, 555 and 556? I would say no. So we do not have a main effect of phototype. If we go to the other IV, word type, we have aggressive, 551 and 559, as if alcohol and plant didn't exist, right? And we have neutral, 562 and 552. So instead of below, we put it to the right side. We call these the marginal means because we put the means in the margins. So if we were to average 551 and 559, we would get 555. If we were to average 562 and 552, what's in between them? 557. So looking at main effect for word type, we are looking at the difference between 555 milliseconds and 557 milliseconds. I would say no main effect for either of them. But we already know, because we used this example a couple slides ago, that there is an interaction. Because again, what you see is as you go in aggressive, as you go from alcohol to plant, it increases from 551 to 559 slightly. And as you go from neutral, from alcohol to plant, it decreases from 562 to 552. So you have one line increasing and one line decreasing. If we're just looking at the main effect, I would say no main effect of phototype, no main effect of word type, but you would see an interaction there. On the bottom, we see the, again, the body weight, light versus heavy, and we see the drinking condition of placebo versus drunk group. We can do the exact same thing to get these marginal means to understand if there is an overall difference. So for IV1 of body weight, we have light men. We take 5.09 and 6 and average them, 5.55. We take heavy men, 4.72 and 7.19, and we average them, and we see 5.96. So in this case, we have to make a judgment call. Is 5.55 on a scale of 1 to 10, is 5.96 significantly higher than 5.5? We're looking at a difference of 5.5 versus 6 on intensity. Really, it's a judgment call. I would probably say yes, but let's look at drinking condition, placebo versus drunk. If we are, for placebo, we have 5.09 and 4.72. If you average those out, you get 4.91. And for drunk, you have 6 and 7.19. You average those out and you get 6 and 6.6. So if, you know, it may be iffy if for light versus heavy men, 5.55 and 5.96. That one you might say, well, maybe it's not enough to make a difference. Well, this one is 4.9 and 6.6. That's a difference of a intensity of 1.5 over the other. 1.7 actually. So I would say, even if it doesn't look like maybe there's not a main effect of body weight, there is a main effect of drinking condition. Because 4.91 is significantly lower than 6.6 on a scale of 1 to 10. Hopefully you're still following with me. So when we look at interactions, we've already talked about how to find it in a graph. We ask the question, is there a difference in the differences? So marginal means will give us the main effects, but how can we use these tables to find out if we have an interaction? And we basically, instead of averaging in the margins for the marginal means, what we do is we just get simple differences. So we just look at the actual numbers themselves. Now we're taking into account both variables, both IVs, right? All 4 levels. And we're trying to see, is there a difference in the differences? So simple differences could be subtracting down or subtracting across. So in this case, for IV1, for phototype, we're looking at subtracting the top from the bottom numbers on each side. So 551 minus 562 gives you negative 11. On the right side for plant, 559 minus 552 gives you positive 7. Is negative 11 and positive 7 pretty different from each other? Yes. The differences are statistically significant. So that tells you, even without looking at a graph, there is an interaction. For the bottom one, we have cell phone condition on the cell phone versus not on the cell phone, and we have younger drivers versus older drivers. Instead of going down like we did for the top one, photo type and word type, we're going to go across. And by the way, you could do it either way, either down or across. And I'll show you that it's interchangeable. So looking at younger drivers on cell phone versus not on cell phone, you have 912 minus 780, which gives you 132. And for older drivers, you have 1086 minus 912, which gives you about 174. Now, again, we're talking about milliseconds. So 132 and 174 might sound like they're significantly different from each other, but in milliseconds, it's really not much of a difference. So we would say these differences are not significantly different from each other. So you would say no interaction. Plus, you guys saw the graph earlier. That might help to refresh your memory. So what if we did it the other way? Well, let's go back to the top one. 551, we did 551 minus 562 first, and then 559 minus 552. Now let's go across. 551 minus 559 for aggressive is going to give us -8. 562 minus 552 for neutral is going to give us +10. So just like we asked, is -11 different from +7? Yes. If we go across, we have -8. Is that different from +10? Pretty much the same thing, whether you go down subtracting or whether you go across. Either way, you'll see there's an interaction. For the bottom one, we went across both times, younger and older drivers. Now, let's look down, on cell phone versus not on cell phone. 912 minus 1086, and we have 780 minus 912. Either way, we get a negative about 250 for on the left. On the right, we get about a negative 132 or something like that, right? And so again, you see about the same difference whether you go across or whether you go down. So it doesn't matter which way you do it. You can do it more than once, or knowing that this is sort of the rule of thumb, you only have to do one set of subtractions, either down or across. But you can do both and get the same answer. So looking at how I said in a simple experiment with only one IV, a bar graph is better because you can see the differences better. Why did I say that a factorial design, a line would be better? Because again, it's really easy to tell. On the left, on A at the top, reaction time for alcohol versus plant, aggression-related words and neutral words, you see that they cross over, and it's really easy to tell there's an interaction there. For the one on the right, with older and younger drivers, you can see that the lines are basically parallel and there is no interaction there. But when you look at it from a bar graph, right, reaction time, we see, okay, yeah, pink is lower and yellow's higher on the left, but for plant, pink or purple, whatever, is higher and yellow is lower, and I guess that's it, right? But up top, boom, lines aren't parallel, interaction. Really easy to tell. Okay, for B, on top you see the lines are pretty much parallel. Okay, no interaction. Now here we see on a cell phone, it's different, but the pink is slightly smaller than the yellow, and not on the cell phone, same thing, but a little less, but the pink is slightly smaller than the yellow. So, I mean, I guess that would be no interaction, but you look up top with the lines, boom, no interaction. It's very easy to spot. That's why with one IV and 2 or 3 levels, very simple experiment, we want to use a bar graph. For a factorial design, especially if the interaction is the most important thing, it is much, much better to use a line graph. All right. So really quickly, we're going to talk about, I said the term that an interaction means that there is a difference in the differences. So if both of them, if both the differences are parallel, it means they either don't change, or they go down and change the same, or they increase by about the same amount, so they don't interact with each other. So when we describe an interaction in words, there are a few sort of different ways that we can do this. Again, we can go back to that memory example from a few slides ago. And we can say when people recall at the water's edge, they do better if they learned the words at the water's edge. Whereas when people recall underwater, they perform better if they learned it underwater. And again, sometimes this just takes practice for you to do. So for the shock intensity and alcohol intake, we have placebo and drunk group, we have light and heavy men. And what we see from the lines, as you go from one to the other, we can describe the way the lines look. So drinking makes everybody more aggressive because we see increases in both lines, but this is especially true for heavier men who increase more than lighter men, right? So there are kind of different ways to go and approach how to describe an interaction. So we talk about interactions being more important than main effects. When a study shows both main effects and interactions, it's good to know there's an effect, right? A main effect, that one level of one IV is higher than the other level of that same IV. But the interaction is almost always going to be more important because you may see real differences in the marginal means, but when you run a factorial design, because of course you could just run separate studies, you could run 2 separate studies with 2 IVs, but the most important thing and why we run a factorial design is because we want to see if one IV interacts with the second IV. So there may be real differences in the marginal means, but the most exciting part is if the variables actually interact with each other. So again, when there is an interaction in your data, it is usually more important than any of the main effects that you may find. So this is a good table to study, as you can see from the slide. And this is normally the point in class where I would have people that I would call on, or I would randomly pick people to help me to see both using the table, simple means, or simple subtraction, and using the graph. And then we would check our work. But allow me to do it for you since this is the format. This is why, again, Psych 92 is not the best for an online class. Psych 1 and Psych 2, a little easier for me. Let's see. Looking in the top row, we have number of accidents as the DV. That's the number in these cells. We have on cell phone versus not on a cell phone. And then we are going to look at marginal means and looking at the graph to see if, and we can look at simple means as well. So looking at the graph, we have younger drivers on a cell phone 10, not on a cell phone 4, older drivers on a cell phone 4, older drivers not on a cell phone 10. Looking at the marginal means, 10 and 4, 4 and 10, either way you slice it is going to be an average of 7, 14 divided by 2. So is there a main effect for age? Younger drivers average 7 number of accidents, older drivers average 7. I would say no, because it's exactly the same number. On a cell phone versus not on a cell phone, your marginal means are 7 and 7. So again, do we have a main effect for cell phone? No. Do we have a main effect for age? No. Do we have an interaction? Well, just look at the graph on the right. It's making an X. One is increasing, one is decreasing. So absolutely, we have an interaction. If we were to look and check the simple cells, 10 minus 4, if we go for younger drivers, 10 minus 4 is 6. Older drivers, 4 minus 10 is negative 6. Is 6 and negative 6 the same or close to the same? No. We could do it the same way going down. 10 minus 4 and 4 minus 10, same thing, 6 and negative 6. They are not different. So if we look at the summary, main effect for cell phone, nope. Main effect for age, nope. Age by cell phone interaction, yes. And how would we describe this? Well, you can just read it from the left and say younger drivers on a cell phone cause more accidents, as you can see, and older drivers not on a cell phone actually cause more accidents. Or you could say older drivers on a cell phone cause fewer accidents in this case. All right, let's go to the next one. We have younger drivers on a cell phone, 10 accidents. Younger drivers not on a cell phone, 10 accidents. So it looks like whether or not they're on a cell phone doesn't make a difference. They have the same number of accidents. Older drivers, 4 on the cell phone, 4 not on the cell phone. Okay, well, let's look at the numbers. Marginal means, 10 and 4 for age of the driver, 7 and 7 for cell phone. So main effect for cell phone? No, the marginal means say 7 and 7, so no. What about for the age of the driver? Yeah, 10 and 4 are significantly different. So using your judgment call, you would say, because that's 2.5 times the amount of accidents if you're calculating, right? 4 accidents versus 10. 10 is 2.5 times more. So you would say, yes, there is a main effect for the age of the driver, in which younger drivers get in more accidents overall. Looking at the graph, is there an interaction? Lines are completely parallel. There's no difference. As you go from cell phone to not on cell phone, there's no difference in older or younger drivers. Therefore, there is no interaction. We have parallel lines. How would we describe this? Well, we would just say no interaction, right? You only are supposed to describe it if there is one, but you can say both older and younger drivers makes no difference if they're on a cell phone or not. And you can say that younger drivers overall get into more accidents, older drivers get into less in this case. Third one, same idea, just looking at the numbers jumbled around, 10 and 4, 10 and 4. So in this case, cell phone, on a cell phone, 10 and 10, not on a cell phone, 4 and 4. We see that marginal means 10 and 4. Is there a main effect of cell phone? Yes. Is there a main effect of drivers? Younger drivers, marginal mean average of 7. Older drivers, average of 7. No effect, no main effect for age of the driver. But let's look at the graph. Well, the graph looks to be 10, 4, 10, 4. It looks to be that the lines are not only parallel, they're just on top of one another. It's like it's one big line. So obviously, this shows it's parallel on top of one another. So definitely no interaction, right? Both younger and older drivers get into the same amount of accidents, whether they're on a cell phone or not on a cell phone. Drivers on a cell phone got into an average of 10 accidents. Drivers not on a cell phone, an average of 4. What about this last one? Younger drivers on a cell phone, 10 accidents, not on a cell phone, 10. Older drivers on a cell phone, 10 accidents, not on a cell phone, 4 accidents, for a total of 10, 10, 10, and 4. If we look at the marginal means, let's again start for cell phone. 10 and 10 is an average of 10. 10 and 4 is an average of 7. We see, is 7 significantly different from 10? Yeah, that's 3 less accidents. That's pretty significant. So we would say, yes, there's a main effect for cell phone. Looking at older and younger drivers, we have the same pattern. 10 and 10 is an average of 10. 10 and 4 is an average of 7. And we would say that, yes, we do have a main effect of age. Younger drivers get into significantly more accidents overall. People on their cell phone get into significantly more accidents overall. Looking at the graph, we see a spreading interaction, right? One line stays the same. Younger drivers get into the same amount of accidents, whether they're on a phone or not. But older drivers get on, have way less accidents when they're not on their phones. So how would you describe this interaction? We would say for younger drivers, cell phones don't make a difference. For older drivers, cell phones cause many more accidents, right? We can same number. So parallel lines and no interaction. Looking at the simple cells, simple subtraction here, if we look at younger drivers, 10 minus 10 is 0, 10 minus 4 is 6. Is 0 and 6 different from each other? Yep. Looking again down, if you go down instead of across, 10 minus 10 is 0, 10 minus 4 is 6, you get the same comparison. So either way, you see an interaction, both using the simple cells and looking at the graph. We're going to do this one more time. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, and then we will take our break there because this is a lot. This is where you would be breaking in class anyway. So we will deal with that after. Looking at the number of accidents, we have 8 and 2 for younger drivers. We have 12 and 3 for older drivers, right? Looking at the marginal means, we start with cell phone. We have 10 and 2.5. Are those different from each other? Yeah, 2.5 times 4. So 10 is 4 times higher as far as accidents. We see a main effect of cell phone. Looking at the age of the driver, 5 and 7.5 seems to be significantly different. 5 accidents versus 7.5. So I would say yes, main effect of age of the driver. Looking at the graph on the right, both of them are decreasing, but the lines are not parallel, right? So we could say yes, there is an interaction that it looks like. That you would say that when people are not on their cell phone, there are far less accidents. And impact of cell phone is larger for older drivers in this case than younger drivers. If we wanted to use the simple cells, 8 minus 2 is 6, 12 minus 3 is 9. 6 and 9 are different enough from each other in number of accidents. If you were to go down instead of across, 8 minus 12 is negative 4, 2 minus 3 is negative 1. Different enough if your number is the number of accidents. For the second one, we have 5, 5, 5, and 5. Guess what? You're not going to see much of anything. One flat line. If your cells are 5, 5, 5, and 5, that means your marginal means are 5, 5, 5, and 5. So you're not going to get a main effect of cell phone. You're not going to get a main effect of driver age, and you're not going to get an interaction. And again, if you just did 5 minus 5 and 5 minus 5, you get the same thing either way. What about the third one? 5, 5, 8, and 2. Well, looking at 5 and 8 is 6.5 marginal mean. 5 and 2 is 3.5. Looking at cell phone, is there a main effect? Yes, 6.5 and 3.5. Big difference, almost double, right? For age of driver, we have 5 and 5. They get into the same number of accidents, so no main effect there. Looking at the way the graph looks, one line is straight, the other line decreases through it. We see a crossover interaction, so obviously it's an interaction. If we wanted to do the simple cells, 5 minus 5 is 0, 8 minus 2 is 6. That is a difference. Going down, 5 minus 8 is negative 3, 5 minus 2 is positive 3. Definitely a difference. So how would you describe this? Well, for the blue line, which doesn't move for younger drivers, it makes no difference if they're on a cell phone. For older drivers, way more accidents when they're on a cell phone than when they're not on a cell phone, just as it says on the left. Finally, on the bottom, we see 8, 5, 2, and 5. So, looking at whether they're on a cell phone or not on a cell phone, 8 and 2 has an average of 5. 5 and 5 has an average of 5. We have no main effect of cell phone. Going across, for younger drivers, 8 and 5, the average is 6.5. For older drivers, 2 and 5, the average is 3.5. We've already established that that is a significant difference in number of accidents, so you would have a main effect for age of the driver. Finally, looking at the spreading interaction, you see that the points come together when they're not on a cell phone, so older and younger drivers have the same amount of accidents, but when they're on a cell phone, there's a big difference. Younger drivers have a lot more accidents when on a cell phone, and older drivers actually have fewer accidents when on a cell phone. Again, just telling from the graph on the right, we see an interaction because the lines are not parallel. If we were to do the simple differences, 8 minus 5 is 3, 2 minus 5 is negative 3. So going across, we have a difference, 3 and negative 3. If you go down, 8 minus 2 is 6, 5 minus 5 is 0. 6 and 0 are definitely different from one another. So again, using this as practice, we can see, using the marginal means, we can look for main effects, and either looking at the graph that's not parallel, or doing the simple differences that are far enough away from each other, and we can say that there is an interaction. One thing I will guarantee you, in the real world, a graph may not be completely parallel, and we have a lot of other things to consider, like and variance and how many people in the group and power and all of those fun statistical terms to actually show, if we were to run an experiment and do our own graphs, to show what the, if they were non-parallel lines, that there may not be an interaction if it's not significant at 0.05 or below. However, my disclaimer for this chapter is that if you see a line that is not parallel, it is an interaction. That means that for the exam, which covers 10, 11, and 12, if I show you something and the lines are not parallel, if there are any lines, it's not going to be ambiguous. You can't say, oh, well, maybe it is or maybe it isn't. And is 3.5 really different from 6.5, right? They're going to be significant enough. And if the lines are not parallel, I'm telling you right now, that means that there is an interaction. It's not going to be a judgment call based on a p-value or anything like that. So why don't we end here, and we can take a mental break, and you can dive in right away, or you can dive in, some other time afterwards, to get to the second part of this lecture. But for now, let's end here, and I will talk to you soon.